The cold rain is a shroud. In October 1415, 6,000 sick, starving English soldiers were cornered by a French army 5 times their size. But King Henry V wasn't praying for a miracle, he was building a tactical machine. His secret? A 6-foot sharpened piece of wood. This is the story of how Henry V turned a muddy patch of ground into the most efficient kill zone in military history. It is the year 1415, and the English campaign has become a desperate retreat. After the long, costly siege of Harfleur, Henry's proud force was ravaged, not by French arrows, but by the relentless sickness known as dysentery. Disease had reduced his once mighty army to a skeleton crew of survivors exhausted, underfed, and marching with the severe dysentery. They were ghosts limping through a hostile land, desperate to reach the ships at Calais. The initial English landing force, which had been around 11,000 men, was now less than 6,000 and falling. Every man carried the gnawing fear that he would collapse, unheeded, into the mud before reaching safety. The French, recovering from their shock, saw their chance for glorious revenge. They assembled a colossal, roaring force drawn from every noble house, an army estimated to outnumber the English by at least 4-1, likely closer to 5-1. This glittering host of French chivalry, convinced of their divine right and numerical supremacy, engaged in a relentless pursuit, a massive hammer chasing a broken bone. The nobles saw this as an easy political victory, arguing constantly over who would have the honor of capturing the English king. This obsession with precedence and glory blinded them to the tactical realities of the chase. They pushed their own horses and supply lines to the breaking point, simply because they refused to allow Henry's small force to escape their clutches. But Henry had a problem only the mud could solve. He needed to turn 25,000 knights into a few hundred helpless targets. Henry V, a king known for his brutal defiance and personal courage, he had famously fought and been wounded at the Battle of Shrewsbury years earlier, understood the grim reality. Surrender was impossible. His only option was to keep moving, trusting in the grim determination of his men. For weeks, they played a deadly game of cat and mouse across the sodden landscape, Henry brilliantly evading the massive French attempts to pin him against the rivers, most notably at the Somme, where he found a forgotten ancient ford to slip through. But the respite was brief. The French scouts constantly harassed his flanks, preventing any rest or foraging. By the 24th of October, near the village of Agincourt, the vanguard of the French army had finally positioned itself to block the road to Calais completely. The terrain itself was becoming marshy and difficult to traverse, forcing the English to slow. The game was over. They had to fight. Henry V refused to display fear. He was a leader of men who were sick and tired, and he knew that to survive, he had to stop thinking like a commander in a normal battle and start thinking like a tactical engineer. He didn't need to win a battle of maneuver or mass. He needed to turn the overwhelming French advantage into a French liability. He gathered his captains, not for a speech about victory, but for a solemn meeting about survival, stressing that the English had their lives to fight for, while the French only had their pride. He would not win with men, he would win with geometry. The only question was, where in this endless mud could he find a trap big enough? The army finally ground to a halt. The king dismounted and began searching the muddy, rain-soaked landscape not for an advantage, but for a hidden weakness in the geography, a natural flaw he could exploit. His gaze settled on the ground between two forests, the woods of Agincourt and Agincourt. It was a cold, brutal assessment of topography, the last hope of a dying army. He recognized that the landscape itself, if used correctly, was worth thousands of soldiers. The English finally halt, turning to face their overwhelming pursuers not in hope, but in grim, weary resolve. The date is October 24th, and Henry V begins searching the muddy landscape for his battlefield. The general doesn't just pick a field, he chooses a grave for his enemy. Henry V dismounts and studies the muddy bottleneck between the woods of Agincourt and Agincourt. It is here, on this churned-up patch of northern France, that Henry V performed one of the most brilliant tactical assessments of medieval history. He did not seek an open plain, he sought a choke point. The king saw the wide, intimidating field where the French knights wanted to deploy, and he immediately saw its opposite. a narrow strip of open ground compressed between the deep woods. This bottleneck was the genius of his choice. The gap was only about 700 yards wide at its narrowest point. This restricted space instantly neutralized the vast numerical advantage of the French. By forcing the engagement into this tactical funnel, Henry V fundamentally changed the nature of the battle. The French force, designed to crush an enemy with overwhelming numbers deployed on a wide front, could not physically organize more than a few thousand men into the initial attack line. The dense woods protected the English flanks, making them impossible to turn, and the sheer width of the French army would turn into a crushing liability, as the rear ranks would simply push the front ranks into the killing zone. It was a masterpiece of battlefield geometry, utilizing the constraints of the terrain to create an artificial parity of force. But the geometry was only half the equation. The other half was the mud. Northern France in late October meant heavy, soaking rain, and the days leading up to the 25th had been miserable. This rain had saturated the clay-rich soil of the field. For the French, laden with hundreds of pounds of the finest European plate armor, the mud was an anchor. Their horses would struggle, slipping and sinking with every stride, their riders becoming exhausted before the fight even began. A knight walking in that heavy, waterlogged armor would expend 3 times the energy as a man in light gear. Henry V understood that the ground itself would become the greatest weapon against the enemy's strength, their crushing weight. He placed his men-at-arms, who were also armored but less numerous, on the firmest ground available, while ensuring the forward ground was a muddy quagmire. The overall French approach was disastrously mismanaged. They were so confident in their numbers that they treated the ground as a minor inconvenience. Their initial position was tactically flawed, and their commanders, consumed by internal arguments over who deserved the honor of leading the charge, failed to coordinate, deploying their massive, cumbersome force in 3 dense, deep lines, each one pressing into the last. They were ready for a glorious cavalry assault, a powerful charge that would roll over the small English line in minutes, never considering that their sheer mass would become the problem. But Henry was not planning a battle, he was building a trap. His strategic shift was fundamental. The English would not attack. They would prepare a perfectly engineered defensive kill zone. His small army, positioned between the woods, was hidden, camouflaged, and protected. Every advantage of the terrain was being ruthlessly exploited to compensate for every deficit in manpower and strength. The field itself would fight for him. The French, arriving in confidence and chaos, see the small English line and dismiss the ground as a minor inconvenience, completely missing the tactical death trap Henry V has set. Every archer is given 2 weapons, a longbow and a 6-foot stake, sharpened to a needlepoint. This is the great equalizer, the defense that kills the horse before the man can draw a sword. This weapon, the humble but utterly lethal anti-cavalry stake, was the great pragmatic secret of the English defensive genius. As the English line settled between the woods, Henry's exhausted men set to work under the cover of night and early morning mist. They were ordered to cut and sharpen thousands of stakes, each one about 6 feet in length and 4 inches thick, and drive them into the soft, muddy ground at a 45-degree angle, angled toward the enemy. These palings, or schiltroms, created an impenetrable chevaux de frise, a hedgehog of wood that was mostly invisible beneath the wet grass and dew. It was a defense so simple, so practical, and so brutally effective that it transformed the English longbowmen from vulnerable light infantry into a protected, front-line weapon system, able to withstand the dreaded cavalry charge. In medieval warfare, a charge of heavy cavalry was the decisive maneuver. Knights were the ultimate weapon. The stakes flipped this dynamic entirely. The French charge would hit this concealed barrier. A horse, seeing the wooden spikes at the last moment, would rear up, unseat its rider, or, more likely, be impaled. The mass of men and horses behind would then crash into the struggling, stalled cavalry, compounding the chaos. The charge, the French's greatest weapon, would be neutralized, becoming a confused, panicked crush of expensive, heavily armored targets, trapped by their own momentum. The archers, protected by this barrier of sharpened wood and mud, would stand just behind the stakes. They were lightly equipped, often wearing nothing more than padded jackets and leather hoods. This lack of heavy armor was another crucial element of the defense. While the French knights were burdened by their steel shells, the English archers were mobile, unencumbered, and deadly. Their position was strategic. The archers formed the front line, daring the French to charge directly into the stakes. They essentially lured the French into believing they could easily smash through the fragile archer line. This simple 6-foot piece of wood was the true battle plan, and the French nobles, blinded by honor, never saw it coming. This approach was a calculated insult to the French ideal of chivalry. The French desired a glorious, one-on-one melee, where a man's courage and pedigree meant everything. The English desired pragmatic survival through engineering and fieldcraft, where a piece of wood meant more than a noble title. Henry V understood that a battle is won not by the number of swords, but by the application of technology and terrain. The archers, with their wooden stakes, represented the triumph of the professional, pragmatic soldier over the aristocratic ideal. They were not fighting for glory, they were fighting for their lives. Please consider subscribing to our channel if you want to see more stories about how forgotten tactics and unlikely heroes changed history. The stakes were the silent promise of death. They were the ultimate equalizer, removing the one advantage the French believed was invincible: the power of their mounted charge. The palings turned the field into a killing machine, designed to defeat the enemy's horse before the enemy's man could draw his sword. As dawn breaks over the field, the sharpened stakes are partially invisible beneath the dew and churned mud, a silent, lethal, unseen barrier waiting for the overwhelming weight of the French charge. A single word passes down the line, a suicidal command for a purely defensive army: advance. Henry V, in a stunning act of audacity, orders his men to move forward, forcing the French to commit. It is around 10 o'clock in the morning. The two armies have been staring at each other for 3 long hours. Henry knew that his men were starving, cold, and riddled with sickness. His exhausted army could not afford a stalemate. The longer they waited, the more their strength ebbed away. He needed the battle to begin, and he needed it to begin under his terms. The command, advance, was the ultimate psychological bluff. The English line, perhaps 6,000 strong, moved forward about 400 yards, effectively halving the gap between the two forces. This movement was designed to close the distance to where Henry calculated was the maximum effective range of his longbows, approximately 250 yards. This movement shattered the stalemate and provoked the French, who were waiting for the English to surrender or retreat. The French had expected the English to remain static, waiting in a fully defensive position. Henry's advance was an act of tactical aggression that shamed the French commanders. They had the superior numbers, the superior position, and the superior armor, yet the tiny, starving English force was advancing on them. This insult, combined with the military necessity of not letting the English escape, forced the French leadership to abandon their defensive position and charge. They could not tolerate the perceived dishonor of being advanced upon by a broken army. The English deployed their men-at-arms in a dense, tight line in the center, flanked by the archers. This was a critical setup. The archers were not just on the ends, they were deployed diagonally, or in a crescent formation, creating a crossfire killing zone. When the French charged, they would be funneled toward the center by the woods, and as they pressed forward, they would be hit from 3 sides: the front men-at-arms and the 2 flanking forces of archers. The narrowness of the funnel ensured the French ranks would compress and deepen, turning every missed step and every fallen man into a multiplier for the chaos. The advance also forced the French to charge across the maximum amount of energy sapping, wet ground. The distance was just enough to turn the charge from a thunderous, morale-boosting sprint into a muddy, exhausting slog. The French, in their heavy plate armor, had to run across approximately 400 yards of thick, heavy clay, a quarter-mile run that would prove fatal. By the time they reached the English line, they were not just targets. They were physically spent, their heart rates soaring, their muscles screaming. Their armor, designed to be magnificent, was now a liability, a cage of steel trapping them in the suffocating mud. The battle, before the first arrow was loosed, had already been won in the mind of the English king. Henry had used the very geography, the very weather, and the very pride of his enemy against them. The strategic advance was the final, perfect turn of the screw, turning the battlefield into a giant, self-destructing mechanism for the French army. If you found this tactical breakdown insightful, please let us know in the comments what other battles you'd like us to analyze next. The French, incited and shamed by the English movement, finally charge a glorious, thundering wave of chivalry that is already spent and pointed directly into Henry's prepared, unforgiving killing field. The first French line hits the stakes and the mud. Then, the sky goes dark. The longbows, unleashed at point-blank range on the compressed, stalled French mass, deliver the slaughter. The moment the French charge began, the battle shifted from strategy to execution, and the English archers were ready. As the French cavalry and dismounted men-at-arms struggled and staggered across the final, waterlogged yards, the English longbowmen began their relentless, devastating work. Because the French ranks were compressed by the woods and slowed by the mud, the targets were packed tightly, sometimes 4 deep. The arrow volleys, delivered at a punishing rate of 10 to 12 per minute per man, became an annihilating storm. It was not a battle, it was a mass execution by ranged weapon. The famous power of the longbow, capable of punching through armor at short range, was devastatingly effective against the dense, panicked French ranks. The sheer mass of the French force, which had been their greatest source of confidence, became their swift undoing. As the front ranks hit the concealed stakes, horses fell and men stumbled, creating an instant, impenetrable pile-up. The knights in the rear, unable to see the chaos or stop their momentum in the slick mud, were pushed forward, crushing their own comrades against the barrier of dead men and sharp wood. The deep ranks of the French turned the field into a deadly hydraulic press, where the French themselves provided the pressure. They could not fight, they could barely breathe, and they could not retreat. The chaos reached a fever pitch. As the French were stalled, the English archers abandoned their bows, grabbing the small axes and swords they carried. They were unencumbered by heavy plate, full of adrenaline, and fresh because the French charge had exhausted itself before it arrived. They were able to climb over the piles of bodies and exploit the gaps, fighting with an agility that the heavily armored, immobilized French knights could not match. The English victory was secured not in a grand melee, but in small, brutal hand-to-hand fights where the exhausted French were slowly overwhelmed by agile opponents who were literally standing on drier, safer ground. The French lost 4 princes, 9 dukes and counts, and thousands of knights, a catastrophe that decapitated the country's military leadership and signaled the end of an era. Agincourt was not a divine miracle. It was a cold, professional masterpiece of military engineering and tactical realism. It was a victory of the professional soldier over the aristocratic ideal, of fieldcraft over fantasy, and of disciplined geometry over reckless passion. Henry V's brilliance lay in understanding that the key to victory was not in the number of his men, but in the intelligent deployment of their unique skill set, transforming a field of mud into the perfect engine of destruction. The result was a psychological and political shockwave that restored English pride and fundamentally changed the course of the 100 Years' War. Agincourt was not a miracle of faith, but a masterpiece of cold, professional engineering, a testament to a king who understood that the true battlefield advantage is not in numbers, but in the ground, the stake, and the unbreakable will of a well-prepared few. If you want to continue seeing these deep dives into the tactics and stories that shaped history, make sure you subscribe right now and turn on notifications. Let us know in the comments which battle you think we should analyze next, and don't forget to share this with a fellow history fanatic.